You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview Mercedes Killeen. Mercedes is an author, poet, freelance writer, poetry editor, and marketing expert. I'm here with Mercedes Killeen, who is, according to my notes, an author, poet, freelance writer, poetry editor, and marketing expert. Mercedes, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yeah, everything that you listed. I'm a poet first. That's where I kind of got my start. I've been doing poetry for about 14 years now. And then, I also do some freelance work as a writer, editor, and marketer, and marketer specifically in the social media space. So that's kind of a little bit about what I do.
You've written the books Using a Spoon as a Knife and Tulips. Are those poetry collections or other types of books? And without spoiling too much of either book, what are they about?
Yeah, they are both poetry collections. Tulips was my first collection. It's a chapbook, so a little bit shorter. And then Using a Spoon as a Knife is more of a full-length poetry collection. Both of them, they kind of center around my experience of mental illness or mental health issues. And then Using a Spoon as a Knife also kind of brings in a little bit of like queer identity towards the end. But a lot of my work is really centered about mental health and kind of sharing my experience of, what it's like to live with mental illness and trying to, raise awareness and kind of break down stigma.
Are your books self-published, traditionally published, or published via a hybrid press?
They're with small presses, with a small press called Grey Borders Books. They're out of Niagara here in Canada. So traditionally published, but on a small scale.
And I'm glad you mentioned that you're from the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, because that's on the U.S. The falls themselves are on the U.S.-Canadian border. So,
yeah, definitely pretty close to the border. Yeah.
Now, are you writing or considering writing more books?
Not at this time. I've kind of switched a little bit more into the teaching sphere of my poetry work. I will kind of do workshops occasionally, lead workshops with fellow poets here in the Niagara area through like the Welland Public Library and things like that. But yeah, I've kind of switched over the years more into the marketing space. And now as I've branched out into the freelancing again, we'll kind of be doing a bit of the marketing as well as the poetry editing and the freelance writing.
What freelance writing services do you offer, and what is the typical profile of a client you would offer freelance writing services to?
Yeah, so I freelanced a little while ago, like maybe 3 years ago. I freelanced for about 3.5 years, and honestly, there wasn't really a particular client profile. I was kind of working in a bunch of different industries with a bunch of different business owners, and yeah, I would typically be offering either blogging or ebook services. I also did a little bit of ghostwriting. Towards the end, I kind of fell more into the personal finance niche. So I did a lot of writing for a publication called The Financial Diet out of New York. So towards the end, I was focused a little bit more on personal finance, but at this point, I'm pretty open to different industries and business owners.
I did not know this was a thing until I started doing research for writing down my interview questions. You offer poetry editing services. What does that entail, and what are major differences between editing poetry and editing, for example, a novel manuscript?
Yeah, as someone who's been a poet for a long time, I can offer more specialized services as opposed to maybe someone who's a little bit more experienced with fiction or other types of prose. So yeah, so I bring my poetry background as a poet to the editing process. And then what that entails is basically doing line by line edits of the entire manuscript, but also including more kind of developmental or thematic edits as well. So I will, in Microsoft Word, go through every single line, every single, stanza, line break, punctuation mark, and add, any type of edits or comments as needed. But then I'll also take a look at the work as a whole and, provide suggestions for maybe restructuring, maybe the order of poems, or maybe, if there's images in the book, maybe we want to take out certain images or add certain images in. So it's both line by line and also kind of more thematic as well.
And the social media space on the internet has changed dramatically in the last couple of years. And how has that affected you in regards to marketing?
Yeah, it has changed a lot with the shift kind of to video content and specifically to short form video content. Yeah, it's just involved kind of, changing up certain skill sets, whereas having static posts, static images with captions used to be kind of sufficient. Now, as a marketer, you really do have to have some of those video, filming and editing skills so that you can, for your clients, create reels or TikToks or things like that, to kind of cater to both the younger audience, but also other audiences that do enjoy that kind of content these days.
I think even YouTube has a short video platform called YouTube Shorts. So it's not just Instagram and TikTok that are getting on the short video
Yes.
landscape.
Yeah, definitely. That's true.
Uh, Now, on your website, you say that the key to marketing anything is crafting a compelling narrative. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think the process of marketing really involves taking your reader or your audience on a journey. That journey might be in the more marketing, technical background, taking them through the marketing funnel, but you also want to be taking them through some sort of story or narrative, whether that's a personal narrative, whether it's a business narrative, of how your business maybe was founded or how your product is made. There's a lot of elements of creative writing or of writing in general that can be transferred over to marketing. So I think, definitely storytelling skills can be infused into your marketing to make it a little bit more effective and a little bit more creative.
Does poetry, creative writing, or both influence your marketing programs? And if so, how?
Yeah, they do, definitely. I'm actually working on a talk right now that I'll be giving next month, about how to write like a poet, how to market like a poet, especially in the age of AI where, writing is being outsourced to ChatGPT often. So the way that it influences my marketing is, as I mentioned, I do focus a lot on storytelling, and also, one part of poetry is really trying to evoke certain emotions from your reader. So you can apply that same principle to your marketing of, really focusing on what kind of emotion am I trying to draw from my audience? How am I going to use my words or use my, visual storytelling mediums to tell that story or to evoke those emotions. So yeah, and then also just in terms of writing and the writing process, I just kind of try to bring a little bit of, yeah, creativity or unique language, or different kind of alliteration or things like that to my marketing work as well.
I'm going to switch to a more serious subject here for one question. What is your best advice to someone who is struggling with mental health problems?
Yeah, struggling with mental health is really difficult. I think the one thing that, I found in my experience and also supporting other people struggling in my life, is, to really, as hard as it is, try to open up and try to ask for that help, or accept that help when it's offered to you. I know it's the hardest thing in the world, and it's very tempting when you are struggling with mental illness or mental health issues to want to isolate or to stay, kind of alone or not want to accept help. But accepting help, whether that is, speaking to a physician or other medical professionals, speaking to a therapist, even just speaking to a friend or speaking to a loved one, just accepting or reaching out for that kind of help really makes a difference.
My final question, what advice would you give to new writers?
To new writers, I would really encourage them to try to find some sort of community where you can interact with other writers. So that might mean, taking like a workshop at your local public library. It might mean enrolling in a course at, a local school or college. Trying to find, or even if you have friends who are interested in poetry, setting up, can we meet up once a month and look at each other's work and kind of share each other's progress and kind of edit or give feedback. I think it's a really crucial part of being a writer is interacting with other writers, getting their feedback. There's some things you really only notice or understand when someone else is looking at the work, because we can kind of get wrapped up in our heads looking at our own work. So yeah, I think trying to find some form of community can make a huge difference at the beginning of your career.
Mercedes, you were an amazing guest for this podcast. I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mercedes was an awesome guest, and I love interviewing people who work in multiple writing-related fields. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. To those who celebrate, have a safe and happy holiday season. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.